Good day. Esri is pleased to present today's webinar with ChainLink Research and GeoDecisions. My name is Cindy Elliott, and I'll be your facilitator and your moderator today. Before we jump into today's presentation, I wanted to provide a little context and background on this body of work and what brings us here today. I've been working with Kevin Bolger a little over a year now, as we have actively engaged with companies looking to advance their performance around supply chain and related to supply chain. And what we found with these companies is that the more they were looking to make advanced decisions about their supply chain, they were also companies that tended to be very growth-minded. How are they helping their organizations fulfill on new market opportunities, fulfill on demand, whether it's new companies or existing accounts, and how are they continuing to use supply chain to better serve and deliver on the promises of their products and services. And as we've had these conversations, we found that consistently there were these challenges and pressures that these companies are facing at unprecedented levels. These are related to global trade. The sheer volume of trade crossing borders today is growing, but it's going to be growing exponentially as new economies and new markets come online. Trade and the complexities of that, and moving across oceans and across land and across air, how are companies really addressing that, not trying to extend traditional practices, but adopting new and innovative ways of kind of fulfilling again on that demand. Another area that companies are kind of addressing is the new levels of connectivity and IoT. But this isn't just about connectivity of assets and trucks and merchandise, but it's actually products once they're in the field, understanding their utilization, how are customers buying, servicing, and maintaining their products, so that through supply chain you're better able to keep things in position, keep your resources at the ready to make sure you can address rising opportunities, customer analytics, and other type of information. And finally, the sheer pace of business today, the fact that we live in a right now economy, that our desire to have things faster and more accurately than ever really is putting, again, that unprecedented pressure on manufacturers and other providers out in the marketplace. And so with this kind of in hand, and the shift that supply chain is really, we're seeing make from a behind the scenes and operational aspect of many companies, these growth-minded, forward-thinking companies are really catapulting supply chain into the CEO suite, right? Making sure that they're not just there to execute supply chain operations, but they're fulfilling on new market opportunities. So it really is shifting the way companies look at supply chain today and moving it into a strategic role within their organizations. So with that in mind, Kevin and I went out to market and engaged Bill and Brian Smith. Bill from the research and where are things going, what is he seeing emerging and happening, and Brian, again, from a practitioner's point of view, the hands-on work that his organization has done with very complex organizations, and how they're adopting advanced practices in supply chain is really what led us to here. With that, I'd like to introduce our participants in today's session. First, that's Bill McBeath. He is the co-founder and chief research officer at ChainLink Research. He has personally conducted over 50 research projects in supply chain, logistics, and IoT, during which he himself has interviewed hundreds and surveyed thousands of executives and practitioners on their challenges and best practices. Prior to founding ChainLink, he was managing director of emerging technologies at Benchmarking Partners and managing director of supply chain research at Marsh MMC. Brian Smith joined Gannett Fleming GeoDecisions in 2000 and has more than 18 years of GIS and spatial IT experience. For the past 16 years, Brian has worked with a variety of customers and partners to solve those complex business challenges using spatial information as the cornerstone of the solution. Brian's experience has spanned over multiple business areas, including logistics and insurance. Over the past 2 years, Brian has co-led initiatives at Gannett Fleming and GeoDecisions to explore and solve common challenges in the IoT space, and we'll see some of those examples today. Along with a team of industry innovators, Gannett Fleming GeoDecisions has developed an innovative approach to solving IoT challenges using GIS and spatial techniques to illustrate and report on sensors, GPS units, and data feeds. Kevin Bolger has been with Esri for 18 years. Located in Dearborn, Michigan, Kevin works with global commercial accounts specializing in manufacturing, supply chain, and transportation industries. His main responsibility is to help customers improve their performance through the use of location analytics. Kevin graduated from the University of Michigan with a degree in computer science. Prior to Esri, he spent almost 10 years with EDS working on a variety of systems in the automotive sector. I'd like to turn the session over to Bill McBeath to take us through those first round of research that he's developed working with us on this program.
Great, thanks so much, Cindy. I'm glad to be here. And since we founded ChainLink in 2002, we've been focused on supply chain, Internet of Things, and more recently on blockchain as our areas of focus. We've always seen that geospatial intelligence has come up again and again as incredibly important for a competitive advantage in supply chain. One of the things that never ceases to amaze me is the diversity of use cases that we see for geospatial systems within the supply chain, and also how much they can function as an integrative platform that really brings together and bridges the silos across an organization and across the supply chain. And we'll talk about a little bit of that as we dive into it. So, why is geospatial intelligence and location awareness so important in supply chain? Is because supply chains are inherently physical, right? I mean, you've got your plants and your manufacturing plants, your distribution centers, your suppliers all over the world. You've got shipments moving, employees moving, and you want to know what's happening around the world that's going to be impacting all of that stuff. The most simple version is about the shipment, right? Where's my stuff? Is it going to get here? And especially I want to know if it's going to be late. But you also want to know about events around the world that are potentially impacting production or suppliers or your customers. And some people are going further and they're using advanced traceability to take a look at batches that came out particularly good or particularly bad, and then trace them back to either the farmers or the plants and saying, what kind of practices did they do that actually made those things come out better, and let's propagate those good practices and clean up the bad practices. We also see these systems being used for various kinds of optimization, like in vehicle routing, making sure you're getting the optimal routes. And kind of taken all together, this gives us a real-time situational awareness across our supply chain, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute as well. Now, why is this happening now? And Cindy touched on some of this earlier, but part of it is we used to have more local supply chains, but of course now supply chains are global and they've been splintered into multiple tiers of suppliers. We want to know where they are, and the pace of events has quickened tremendously. We have much quicker, shorter product life cycles. We're trying to compress cycle times everywhere across the operations, and people expect real-time knowledge, what's happening right now. At the same time, this has all been enabled by the much lower cost of sensors and IoT, and you can thank probably Apple and Samsung and others for making some billions of phones for driving down the cost of GPS and cameras and inertial sensors and wireless and all of that. We've also seen an incredible richness of data and mapping, an explosion, if you will, of data that's location associated data, which would include cars driving around with cameras on them, and also even mapping of indoor spaces so that you can get a complete end-to-end view that's enabling all of this to happen. And one of the things about geographic systems is that the human brain processes visual images much better for certain kinds of data. And so the presentation of the data really matters, and this is where maps become really important. So just to try to make the point here, we have this hypothetical use case, which is you've got 5 distribution centers. It's a home delivery operation in the San Francisco area. We could describe that in text, the address of the locations, how many orders there are queued up for each one, and so forth. That's really hard to absorb. We can do a little better by putting it in the table. Now you can actually compare things and do a much better job of comparing across these. Graphs are also great for doing the comparison of maybe the number of stops or the minutes driven. Once you bring a map into this picture, you get this richness that's really not possible, and very rapidly you can look and you can see, okay, DC number 5 there, which is the one delivering to the blue dots, is the one that's driving that long distance. And I've got these clusters of customer deliverables that aren't assigned yet in white. So all of that, to try to describe that in text or any of these other forms, it just doesn't do the job. And that's why maps and geospatial systems are so incredibly important for so many different types of supply chain challenges. Now, there's a lot of data that's got to get in there. So we want to represent, these things are a representation of the real world. And generally the way these work is you'll get each type of data in its own slice, if you will, or its own layer. And you bring these all together to create an integrated map. Might be the address of all my DCs, maybe my customer's address, and then maybe I've got a real-time GPS feed of where my trucks are, and all those different layers and feeds of data get put together into one integrated map that onto which I might turn on and off the layers as I needed, and so forth. So stepping back and thinking about all those different sources of data and also the different use cases that use the data, we can see that without a GIS system, there's a tremendous amount of complexity and also siloed use cases. So this diagram that you're seeing on the left is really 5 different categories of siloed data. You've got your enterprise data from your enterprise systems and including spreadsheets, et cetera. You've got trading partners, got other data, orders and forecasts and so forth. Third-party sources like D&B and LexisNexis and others. Public sources might be social media, and government sources like trade data and census data, et cetera. So this whole universe of data, and on the right side, you've got individual users across different enterprises and use cases, which are either upstream facing, supply chain, or downstream customer facing, or global trade, regulatory, how do I get stuff across borders, or the underlying logistics of actually moving. So let's just, if you take a single use case, in this case, multi-echelon inventory planning or management, which is commonly used for service supply chains. Should I put this part in, or how many parts should I hold in my central DC, my regional DC, and out at the depots? And so I pull in this data, maybe I'm pulling it into a spreadsheet or a planning tool. I've got inventory data from one system, customer records from another, forecast from another, and maybe service for doing the actual service for me, and bring that all together to solve that problem. Now you've got someone else in the organization just trying to do supply chain risk. They're pulling in some of the same records. They give them the inventory data, maybe the forecast, but they're also getting weather, social media, denied parties, etc. So you multiply this times 1,000, right? And what you've got is data all over the place, and use cases all over the place, and people all over the place using that data in a completely sort of unintegrated way, each pulling their own data into their own systems. And this reinforces not just the data silos, but the silos of functionality within corporations. So it makes it harder for people to collaborate across those boundaries. So this is where I talked about GIS as an integrative platform, and it can actually do some amazing things once you do the work to actually get all of that data on the left into this platform and in the different layers. It can do an amazing job as a collaboration platform and help bridge some of those gaps and make some higher level use cases across the different types of users and organizations. Now, once you've done that work and brought all this data into a platform, you have this amazing live global operating picture of what's happening in your supply chain. So in this case, we've got some somewhat static data, which is the P's and the ones there, which are my own plants and my tier 1 plants, and I could have tier 2 and 3 plants. And I can also see the trade lanes and the volumes of trade lanes. And in this case, we're doing some looking at various risks and events around the world and kind of the intensity of those. It can zoom me right in on particular risks. You could imagine if, and we've seen this kind of scenario, there's a hurricane approaching, and so I get an alert, and I click on that, it brings me to a map like this, and it highlights exactly which plants might be impacted, and maybe with another click, I can send some sort of message to those plants, which might be a mix of supplier plants and my own, with a survey that says, are you aware of this? What kind of preparations you have? And maybe more to the point, after the hurricane is hit, try to find out the recovery time and so forth. So these tools can be made not just for becoming aware of these events, but also responding to the events as well. Now, I want to make the point that that was a sort of somewhat real-time example. This is a more long-term planning example. So there are different time horizons on which it can be used. So I've got my various 7 DCs around here, and the circles around the DCs are the 1, 2, 3, and 4 hour drive time. So this tool is aware of the traffic, the average traffic and average drive times. And it's also pulled in my entire customer database, and that's what those little dots are, highlighting all the customers outside the 4 hour drive time, so that I can see, is there an underserved area? In this case, I might decide maybe I need another DC in southeastern Ohio or someplace near to serve that cluster of underserved customers. We can also drill down into individual shipments. So just to take it to the other extreme. So let's say I'm monitoring all my trucks to see which ones are going to be late. In this case, I get this alert that my customer is expecting a delivery at a certain time, and there's been maybe this really major accident or a spill that's virtually closed down the highway here, and we're going to be late. So I can also see inventory. Again, this is as an integrated platform, bringing in all this data into one platform. Where is the inventory for that same unit available? And you might not do this for every shipment that's going to be late, but in this case, if it's critical shipment and critical customers, and I want to save that relationship, I can see that I can get it there from another DC on time. So what we've shown here is that GIS supports decisions across these time frames, everything from the strategic decisions that are years out, where should I put my DCs, all the way to what's happening right now, and across these 4 dimensions of planning, as well as monitoring what's going on, then responding to what's going on, and improving everything. And so you get a really rich set of use cases here that we're seeing that Brian and Kevin are also going to give you some great examples on. Once you put all this together, it's this incredibly powerful tool that can give you a competitive advantage. Starting with building a stronger brand and building up your revenue and profitability. Whether it's a high-end brand where your customers want to know exactly where this came from, and we've seen some cases where they actually use the same platform, not just to show the provenance, but to help connect to that farmer or that artisan who's made it. All the way to how do I optimize my resources? Where should I put my stores? Making sure I have inventory in the right place. I'm never out of stock. Those kinds of things actually can help you increase your revenue as well as your profitability. And of course, profitability by optimizing your operations, you're going to be able to increase profit as well. And that might be route optimization. It might be, we talked about finding and discovering best practices. There's all kinds of dimensions of that we see. Service in particular is an area that has very much rich with geospatial components. If you think about the problem, I've got a customer who needs something fixed at a specific location. I've got a bunch of technicians at other locations, vehicles, specialized equipment, and inventory, and I need to kind of coordinate this dance across all these different entities that make it work optimally well as planning into the future. When your sales guy is calling up and promising a service level, make sure that they don't promise something you can't deliver, or make sure that they're upselling when they're able to. Risk management is a really rich area as well. And here we get into things like mapping out your multi-tier supply network. You see people doing that. We're using these tools out in the field to collect data, doing audits and surveys and so forth, doing contingency planning, and of course, becoming aware of events as they happen. Lots of companies are using these as the centerpiece of their response war room, so that when things do happen, they can have a great situational awareness in real time, not just of the event, but also the response and how's the response going and where's help needed, etc. All the way down to this individual, we talk about cargo security. You might geofence all your trucks or even track them and see, hey, this one stopped where it's not supposed to. Do they need a mechanic to repair their truck, or do they need a policeman because they're being robbed, and so forth. So if you put all this together, and we're seeing the geospatial platforms and this location intelligence is becoming really, really important, and actually has been for quite a while. But all the tools are in place now to help people use these to gain this tremendous competitive advantage with these platforms.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate you sharing these insights into the paper, and look forward to making that available to our attendees today. Now I'd like to hand the session over to Kevin Bolger and Brian Smith. As I mentioned, these are two colleagues that have interacted quite extensively with practitioners across the globe, and how they're adopting advanced practices for geospatial intelligence, GIS, inside their organizations. Kevin, why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Cindy. I want to cover a few things today. First of all, I want to talk about how we take all this information that you use in the real world and we create a holistic view of what we call a live digital global operating picture. And what this really does is it helps us understand in real time or near real time our global network and the relationships that are happening around that network. And of course, what this really does for us is it allows us to take action proactively, whether that's something happening around the world and I need to react to that, or if I want to try and uncover some potential new business opportunities like Bill talked about earlier today. When we think about our traditional supply chains, most of us think of it in these individual silos, and it's a real linear process. And the problem is that we have a lack of visibility when we think about how things are impacted downstream. So that causes what we all typically refer to as a ripple effect. And in the end, it means we're out there fighting fires and we're trying to make decisions based on incomplete information. And of course, that raises our costs and doesn't help us provide the service level that we're really striving to meet. The reality of a supply chain is it's this interconnected web of nodes, and we have to understand how that fits between each other. That complex network, we need to have a digital, physical representation of where everything exists globally. And we need to understand what impacts regulations or laws have on all of those relationships that we're trying to look at. So we need to be able to filter out all of these noise type events that are going on and understand what's important to us. So one of the first things that we do when we work with our customers is we help them understand where everything exists globally. And it can be as simple as understanding where all of our plants and our facilities, our suppliers, and our tier 1, tier 2, if we have the information, tier 3 suppliers exist in the world, so that we can start to understand the impact of things that are going on in those regions or in those locations. So typically what we see is we have all this information into a platform, and that then gets represented in different ways. So we can interact with those things and we can understand where our plants are, where those tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers are, maybe where our distribution centers are. But we can also start to interrogate things against this. So I can zoom in and I can take a look at maybe a particular retail outlet, or in this case, we're using an example of automotive dealerships, right? So we can look at how those dealerships are connected on the highway system. In this case, we're looking at the major trucking delivery routes across the United States. And for any individual location, I can go in and I can interrogate that location and get attribute information to understand what is being sold or developed or produced at a particular location. In this case, I could go and look at a particular supplier and I could filter out information based on that supplier. In addition to that, I want to know what's happening around these locations. So I don't just want to understand those locations, I want to bring to it other types of data. So information about events like hurricanes or flooding or civil unrest, anything that might be happening in a particular area that will enable me to understand the impact or the potential impact on my supply chain or my manufacturing capabilities. So when we think about that, it's not just about where things are, but it's actually how things are connected. So I need to understand where my supplier is and how it's connected not only to other suppliers, but up to my manufacturing facilities and then out to my distribution centers, and then potentially all the way out to my retail outlets. Once I understand those relationships, I can start to do traces and I can understand the impacts. But if I just have all of the relationships on here at one time, it makes it difficult. So what I really want to look at is understanding that relationship between a particular location and everything either upstream or downstream. So that if there's a hurricane event or a flooding or something like that, and I can see that it's a potential impact of something in Hong Kong, I can now trace upstream or downstream and determine those impacts and start to make decisions based on real intelligence. I have an example that I can share with you. We have one particular customer that is in the produce business, and they actually have instrumented everything from the field so that when they pick their product, they're actually scanning information about that product from the time it's picked all the way through the retail outlet. And this is providing a lot of different types of information for them. So not only is it allowing them to understand the path and the time it takes to get from field out to the retail chain, but it also helps them understand any potential bottlenecks so that they can make their process more efficient. And on the back end of this whole thing, it allows them to start to take a look at if there's either a particularly great batch of produce, now they can trace it all the way back to where it came from and do an analysis of what they did in that particular part of a field to produce that good quality product. Or if there's a problem with a product, it makes it much more effective for them to figure out where that product was grown or processed and be able to trace that through the system, so that if they have to do a recall or any kind of regathering of that product, they can do that effectively and efficiently. So once we have all this information and we have it in a system that allows us to start to visualize it, trace it, understand the relationships and the connections, I also need to start to think now about things that are happening around the world. And I don't just want to know that something happened and when something happened. I want to know that something happened in relation to something that's important to me, a supplier, one of my plants, one of my manufacturing facilities. So not only do I want to understand the events that are going on, but I only want to be told about it if it's important to me, because I can't pay attention to everything at one time all of the time. So this is where the next level of that spatial analysis comes in and allows me to start to understand those relationships and proximity to things that matter to me. So as a part of this, we work very closely with one of our partners, and I'm going to turn this over to Brian Smith right now to give us some more insight into how we look at that from a spatial perspective.
Thanks, Kevin. One of the things we wanted to do is go over a few practical applications of GIS as we see it. In this case, the screen capture is actually showing an agricultural company in California. All the little green dots are the location of their assets. In this case, they're trailers or tankers or any type of thing that's moving their particular produce. Why this is important is because we can take harvest schedules, for example, insert them into this map, and by inserting those harvest schedules into this map, what we have the ability to do is stage their assets for more efficient means of pickup and delivery. What's also important about this is the long-term objective. Kevin talked a lot about the real-time scenario, and one of the things I don't want to lose track of is the actual analytics that we can look at after the fact. Because we're bringing this into a GIS, because we have that ability to look at location-based analytics, we can look at how assets are performing in relationship to a harvest or in relationship to one another. So in the next screen capture here that I'll show, what this is a zoomed in version of one of those particular assets. It'll tell you a particular message type, tell you a speed. Basically, it's pulling the information from the asset itself. It'll also tell you an address, for example. it has the ability to look at different messaging. This is standard AVL GPS type information for sure. But as we take a look at the next slide, now we're starting to look at different types of alerts. As we look at where the asset is, we also can look at how it's performing. And what I mean by that, in this case, if you see this particular asset is within a geofence. Why that's important is something like a retainage fee or a detainage fee. In the case of this particular client, what they're set out to do is understand how long an asset was within a geofence. That geofence could be a port. That geofence could be a yard. It could be an area where they're harvesting, whatever. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to understand how long they were there. In the case of a port, they want to know how long they were there because they're being charged for the time at that port. So the information is then gathered, assessed, a duration is developed, and then sent through a different API back to a transportation management system. And that's where the calculations take place. On the next screen here, what we've done is we've looked at same data, in this case, long range trucking. Bill and Kevin both mentioned the idea of ETA. What this is just a view simply of assets going from point A to point B, and you can see along the left-hand side if they're speeding, if they're late, if they're idle, etc. The important thing to remember about the GIS platform in this case is that because each of these is based on the same underlying platform, each of these screen captures, each of these apps, if you will, can be easily created or configured to what your needs are. So looking at this, same back-end information, same data, same platform, and gives us the ability to really kind of take a look at all of those components. In this case, you'll see that this is on a mobile-based application. We talked a good bit about alerting earlier. This gives you the opportunity to see, hey, you know, I'm behind schedule. The delivery is expected in 15 minutes. And then you click on the link, and that link would take you to the map there and potentially see where that particular asset is and specifically how close they are to my location. So happening in real time. The next screen here is actually an interesting scenario. This is a little bit more complex. This is actually helicopters. These helicopters use the same platform as I was showing before, the same application actually, but in this case what they do is they actually have communication to the pilot. They see when things are taking off, when they're landing, who's on them, estimated time of arrival, all of that. So the point behind this screen is that you can actually start to build your own business layers and business processes all around the GIS and begin to store that information for historical purposes. On this screen, what we're demonstrating is the view of the same data, in this case, potentially distribution centers or any type of person, asset, etc. And the polygon that you see on top of it could potentially be a storm. And what we've done is we've actually created an alert based on that weather polygon. Now, why this is a tad bit different than normal alerting systems is because we can be spatially accurate. Kevin mentioned that earlier, the concept of being spatially accurate. And what we're trying to do is enabling the underlying platform to provide the data and the tool set on top of it to then become spatially accurate so that you're getting the information that you're concerned about and only the information that you're concerned about. This type of thing can be automated. It can be automated to look at storms. It can be automated to look at traffic, ETAs, whatever, or you can actually use it in the case of what you see here by drawing a polygon potentially or creating a polygon through a weather system and grabbing everything in it and then sending that notification out via text and email or phone call. Those are my initial comments here. I'm going to hand it back over to Kev.
Thanks, Brian. So we really talked about three key concepts today. Visibility and our ability to be able to understand where things are around the world. Real time and the capability to look at things in real time as they happen and the potential impacts they have on us. And the ability to be proactive, to understand ahead of time where things may be impacted if a particular type of event happens. That gives me the power now to be able to understand and create a resilient supply chain.
Excellent, Kevin. Thank you for that. Thank you for Brian, Bill as well for chiming in. And it's been mentioned before, a great body of work that spans several months that we've been doing some detailed analysis. Once the paper is produced and we're creating an executive summary of it now, we'll make that available for everyone on the line today. One of the questions, and it's something that we hear quite often with many of the organizations that we work with, is this concept or the strategy of maintaining a complete live global operating picture across the supply chain seems ambitious and maybe a little unrealistic. And the question really came around to, can companies actually achieve this full vision? What is a practical approach to getting there? So Bill, if you would kick us off, and then I know Kevin would also have some comments to build this out.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. That's a great question. And what we see is that companies are borrowing a little bit from the software engineering concept of minimum viable product to do this minimum viable implementation. So what that means is you should have a vision for the future of where you want to get to in the long term. Think globally, but act locally. But you're also probably coming to this with some very specific problem that you're trying to solve today. That's a doable problem. And so obviously don't try to boil the ocean, and really focus in on something where you can get some quick win and quick value, and then build on that momentum. But I think it is important to have that vision as well, so you're not just picking a point solution to solve this one problem and missing this opportunity to start to build out over time, piece by piece, using a expandable geospatial platform, all of these pieces of the puzzle. So you might start with just asset tracking and maybe a specific class of assets in a specific region, and starting to either tag those with GPS or whatever. And so it's okay to start small, but I would say, have that vision so you can see where it's taking it, and then build on your successes one at a time.
Thanks, Bill. Kevin, would you add something to that based on what you've experienced?
Sure. So building on what Bill said, realistically, when we're engaged with our customers, there's some basic things that they're really looking to do first. And it kind of highlights the idea that there's so much unknown today. And as we think about all the technology we have available to us, the idea that we wouldn't know where something is located is a little bit foreign to us. But that's the reality of what's happening in a lot of our large manufacturing and other types of customers that are looking at this type of technology. So what we tend to do first is just get them that visualization of everything and where things are. Back to what Bill said, take steps into the ability to start to understand their environment, what's going on around them. And then we can build from that and start to look at other things like tracing and being able to do automated alerts, some of the stuff that Brian talked about in his presentation too. So I really think that it's important to take advantage of the kind of the concepts of what Bill said as you're stepping into this idea of using location and spatial technology to help you understand the impact that the technology can have on your day-to-day business operations.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Kevin. Let's talk about risk, like real-time imminent risk or disaster or crisis. The direction of some of the questions are, outside of a natural disaster or political, what are some of those types of risk? And I think, Kevin, if you wanted to kick us off and not talk just about the types of risk, but where do we normally get that real-time data, right? The question was, is it IoT? Are there other elements of real-time data that we layer in? So I'll let you, what are the types of risk besides the ones you kind of mentioned already, and then where do we get our real-time data?
Sure. So I break risk into two pieces, and there's the real-time aspect of it, which is the things we've talked about with hurricanes and everything else. There's also data that we bring in that is risk data that's associated with the likelihood of something happening, right? The capacity for something to have flooding, or the idea that there would be a drought in an area. So there's those types of things that people look at to understand if I have a facility somewhere, or if I'm looking to put a facility somewhere, what's the risk associated with that area. When I bring these things together, what I get is a capability to start to look at not only proactive but reactive type events, right? Now I want to bring not only my location information together with this event data and the real-time feeds, because now I can be proactive about where I'm placing things, but I can also be reactive as things are happening. And these data sources come from many different places. So places like in the United States here, NOAA, or we can get information from some private companies that aggregate data and collect data about terrorist activity, or civil unrest, or weather type events, tornadoes. All of these things are placed into a single web service that can now be consumed and brought into spatial technology and used to do proximity analysis against our assets that we're concerned about.
So Kevin, can I ask a question? So in that regard, when you talk about NOAA and things like that, we might want to describe the type of data sources those are, but also the fact that these can be layered together, right? They're not just single points of reference. That organizations and the type of analysis or visibility they want to see, they can bring these things together, right, around a common point.
Sure, that's a good point, Cindy. I guess I should have highlighted that. When I talk about all these different sources, it's not about just looking at one at a time. It's about being able to use those in a model and being able to use all that information layered on top of each other. In the case of a proactive analysis, to be able to score things, right? So I can take any number of layers of risk data, of my plant information or my facility information, of shipping networks, whether that be trucking or rail or ocean, and I can use all of those as part of an analytic process and use that together to come up with risk factors that I need to be concerned with. You asked about NOAA. Obviously, that's the weather feed that we have in the United States, but there's also other vendors like AccuWeather and others that provide subscriptions to weather feeds and can give you everything from natural risk disaster type things to the rain happening in a particular zone and how long that rain's going to be there.
Well, and historic patterns as well, right? So that they're being, you're both saying. Oh, great. And
Cindy?
Yes, go ahead, Bill.
I just wanted to add to that. We live in data-rich times, and so if you think about real-time data, I've seen people using geocoded tweets. Now, you might say, how accurate can those be? But if there's an event going on, you'll start to see people tweeting about it, and if you have the right kind of AI behind it, you can start to sense things from that, or from other kinds of social media, as well as news feeds are much more real time. So besides the IoT data, there are other sources of real time data, and of course the ones that Kevin mentioned as well. And we're starting to see this a little more futuristic, but people are starting to do IoT data marketplaces as well, so that it's not just your own machine data, but you could start to potentially tap into other people's machine data. And if you have the right kind of intelligence, whether it's complex event processing or machine learning behind it, you can start to make sense of those oceans of data.
Great, thanks, Bill. To continue down this conversation of risk that seem to be in risk, and it's not just as we talk about imminent, crisis risk, but long, risk patterns over the entire supply chain. One of the key areas that Brian alluded to, but there's been some more question on it, is that with your track and alert technology with GeoDecisions, Brian, how's that kind of relayed out? Is risk extremes are various, the types of risk are various? How do you vary the responsiveness as a result of those things?
It's really configurable to what our customers want to see and how they want to see it. So often we'll set up different layers, or I shouldn't say layers, but levels of risk, and people will be notified based on the level that either they sign up for or the company provides to them. You know, and so it can be both from a spatial perspective, which I mentioned during the talk, but then also, you know, really what you want and what you want to receive. So you're not kind of, you know, overloading people with the information. It can, you know, it can be spatial based on where people are. It can be spatial based on areas that you're concerned with. It can be spatial based on from like a corporate security standpoint, where you're flying to, and be proactive or historically active as well. What I mean historically active is kind of looking at things across the board, history-wise. You know, the question that came across was likelihood of drought. You know, a lot of customers, you know, have a lot of this data internally right now, and being able to take that customer information, analyzing it through something like Insights or other tool sets that are out there, really provides a capability a capability towards predicting risk.
And the scale of it, so it's the small, medium, all the way to full-size enterprise organizations. Is that right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It can be scaled from, you know, organizations with 10 people all the way up to organizations with, you know, hundreds of thousands.
Okay. Who uses this data? Who uses the maps? And it's not just the data analysts anymore, right? It could be anyone across the enterprise, whether they be in the field or kind of a dashboard or an ops center. Kevin, what kind of I don't think there's a best practice per se on how to share this information, but what are some of the platforms and ways that different stakeholders in the enterprise are using this data?
Yeah, we're seeing it in a lot of different places now. You know, traditionally, like you mentioned, Cindy, we've got the analysts or maybe the supply chain specialist or risk manager who are looking at, you know, how they figure out the problems. But really what we're seeing now is that not only are those people looking at things, but they're sharing that information with other folks within the organization, back out to the purchasing folks, so they can understand how to evaluate risk with potential new suppliers. And then, of course, up to the organization management, whether that be executives or directors, who may not want to understand in detail what's going on from a day-to-day basis, but want to have a dashboard, per se, and be able to take a look at the health of the supply chain. So what risks are going on, and if there's something happening in a particular area, just show me that there's something going on there, and then, you know, I'll let my people be able to take an in-depth look at that. But it's that ability for people within the organization to be informed and understand potential impacts within the organization, and be able to understand that there's other folks within the organization who are gathering and developing information, and have a platform, in this case, a spatial platform like the Esri platform, that can share that information in multiple different ways to everyone else.
And I think part of the question was, you know, is it through an app or say, but I would say this is where the platform, yeah, Brian, I was going to say.
You know, I think that the ArcGIS Online or the ArcGIS Portal platform really lends itself to, you know, enabling configurable apps, or, you know, what I call business process apps that can be more custom built. When you break down the online or the portal platform, it comes down to something that's called a web map. And if you can think of that as kind of a data container, that gives you the ability to create multiple web maps and then put, you know, different apps on top of it that are specific to individuals or groups of people. so that they don't have to go in the traditional sense of what GIS used to be, this kind of big dump as much data into one app as possible and confuse people. Now we have the ability to make very streamlined apps, apps or applications or mobile apps that really help individuals, so they can come to an app and get the information. Like Kev said, you know, if they want to come to an app and it's a dashboarding app, very easy to do as long as the data is there. So, you know, the Esri platform has done us a favor to enable information out to the masses.
These apps can travel into the field and then collect automated data, but they also can collect, individuals can collect data when they're out in the field. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And one of the neat things is through some of the notification stuff, you can actually send links in text messages that would enable people to either collect that data automatically or individually. So,
well, even taking pictures, right? Annotating them and being able to apply them to the process, I think, is the key aspect of the capability. Thank you again, Bill, Brian, and Kevin. It's been fun working with you over the last few months, and I know we're not quite over the finish line yet, but I appreciate all of your hard work and contribution to this project. Thank you, everyone.